But it's time, of course, to have now some erudite young voices on stage as well. Yes, India is a very young country. We have a very young demographic. And how do we harness not just India's young and their potential, but the world's youth? And how do we engage further with them? What is the next gen's viewpoint on the way forward for the world? Well, the next session, of course, is Next in Next Gen. And for this, I would like to now invite on stage Ariel Lawrence. She's CEO, the Asclepian Group. Could we please have you on stage, Ariel? Also with us is Chandler Pope Compton. He's a U.S. Marine veteran. Also with us, Aaron Ballas Rimanier from Duke University, very prominent university in the United States of America. We also have with us Sumati Joshi. She's a Schwartzman Scholar. Also with us is Manthan Shah. He's also a Schwartzman Scholar. And joining us today also from MIT, again another very, very prominent institute, is Lipika Kapoor. So a lot of young voices, and we also need a dynamic young individual to moderate. So who do we have? Well, we have Namit Choksi with us, MD, MPH, and he, of course, is also Executive Director, the Asclepian Group. So thank you very much. Let's welcome all of them on stage. What a youthful panel. And now the energy and the floor is all yours, Namit Choksi.
Thank you. Well, they joke that I have more degrees than a thermometer at this point. I don't know if I put them to good use. But very grateful to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming from near and far and for joining us today. This has been a phenomenal experience, and I hope all of you are really enjoying. For all the folks in the audience, you know, the question could be, what's next in Next Gen? It's really a panel where we are trying to attempt the impossible, which is trying to predict the future. Our panelists, I'd like to think, are shaping what's next, whether through groundbreaking innovation, through leadership, or just surviving never-ending Zoom calls. We'll tackle all questions, big and small. What's changing, who's leading, and will AI take our jobs or just do our emails for us? Let's find out. So, without further ado, let me get to my first question, which is, what's the next breakthrough or game-changing trend in your field that we should all be really paying attention to? And Lipika, if you could start us off, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Namit. So my field, I'm an investment banker, moved into it from policy. But what next gen means for me in finance, I would say it has to come at the combination of using AI for financial services. And I would think of it coming into picture in three ways. One, how can we reduce costs? Two, how can we increase and improve revenue opportunities? And third, how can we improve the financial inclusion using alternative data? So for the first point, for reducing costs, I think AI is very important, has an important role to play to automate the mundane tasks and thus leaving the human intelligence for more strategic decisions and roles. For revenue optimization, I think we need to use AI increasingly more to find out patterns that can help increase services for the clients, as well as provide new offerings and permutation and combinations that are not possible to, figure out by just human eyes. So I think it takes leaps in terms of the offerings. And lastly, for financial inclusion, I feel given the variety of income levels, we have been using alternative data sources like rentals, credit scores, etc. And I think we need to keep using AI-based models to offer more credit lines, payment options, and embedded finance optionality to different income groups. So I would say these are the ways in how I see next gen in finance using AI for a lot of optimization, automation, and extended client services for financial inclusion.
Well, thank you for that, Lipika. Clearly shows the number of hours you spend in your bank office. I I can switch gears a little bit and move to Ariel. I know, Ariel, you run like an alternative asset management fund in a way, where I also work. But would really love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I am happy to chime in. Thanks so much for the introduction. So the Asclepian Group is an alternative growth investment vehicle that sits within the entrepreneurship within acquisition space, or through acquisition space. And I think what has been particularly novel in finance, it was just spoken to a little bit, is kind of the increase in financial literacy that has occurred in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think in large part that's actually credit to social media. I should pause here and probably encourage all of you to not take social media advice as your primary source of wealth management. But I do think that the conversations that are had in terms of financial literacy, individual investment strategies, debt management strategies have been really important in that they've improved general awareness, general acumen around financial vehicles, around investment mechanics, and that has really brought more participation in the marketplace, more engagement in the marketplace. And as a result, there is just evolution in the kinds of assets that are being traded, the kind of assets that are drawing attention. So if you think about historically, if you're not in a true commodities marketplace, if you're investing in organizations, that has been pretty exclusive, right? In a venture capital or private equity, it's been a very concentrated set of LPs, it's family offices, it's high net worth individuals. It's been a pretty exclusive group, but as you start to see this improvement in literacy, this improvement in engagement, this increase in digital access, you're seeing more fractional participation. You're seeing just general variation in these asset vehicles, and that's actually where Asclepian sits, is somewhere in between venture capital and private equity, in that we invest and operate alongside operators, but we are, in very many ways, very similar to a search fund, which is a type of investment vehicle that I know we'll talk about in greater detail and depth tomorrow. But I think that all of this to say, the improvements in literacy, the increase in technology, the innovations, the gamification of some of this trading, whether you agree with it or not, it has really been pretty impactful in the field and will likely continue to be so.
Well, I think that's very helpful, Ariel. And as we think about financial literacy, it's a good way to kind of string into Chandler, right, who can talk about education. And I know you served in the U.S. Marines, and would love to really hear your perspectives there of what's next.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a big conversation we could have about the future of warfare and the way that's changing thanks to AI and a lot of new applications of emerging technologies. But what I'd really like to talk about is how, everyone knows the Marine Corps is a world-class warfighting organization, but it's also a world-class human development organization. And I think I've been really blessed to follow my time on active duty service with my Fulbright Scholarship and Studies here in New Delhi, India, where I've been living for the past 3 months. And as we think about education and building leaders over the next several decades with applications of AI, I think that there are so many ways that the field of education is going to change, but some things that won't change are the problems that AI cannot solve. And for me, there's really no substitute for on-the-ground lived experiences and relationships that you have through educational exchange and cross-cultural training that comes from programs like Fulbright and other programs that allow people from different cultures to actually live and work on the ground in a new familiar place. So, as you think about building leaders for the next generation, I think that on top of the conversation about all the new applications of AI, I think we also need to have one about the things AI cannot do. And lived experience is certainly on top of those lists. And I think the best takeaway I would give to the group is that, AI might be able to give me the comprehensive history of the Taj Mahal and tell me everything about it, but it can't, produce that feeling of seeing the sunrise and seeing it for the first time. And there's just no substitute for that. So as we move forward, I think any opportunities that governments and leaders can facilitate for young people to conduct cross-cultural educational exchange, I think is an absolute must.
Well, thanks, Chandler. Great perspective, and a fun fact about him is he's studying Hindi here in Delhi as a Fulbright scholar, so welcome to India, really, and hope you find a piece of home here. Aaron, do you want to kick us off on what's next in global affairs, you know, given your background.
Thanks, Namit. So when we ask the question of what's next in global affairs or international relations, I would challenge everyone here to take a step back. And let's evaluate the international system in ways that you might not have thought about before. Let me highlight 3 ways that I challenge you to think about the new international global order. Right? So the first one is evaluating the international system in terms of tipping points. We as humans are hardwired to think of history, progress, social development in linear terms. The rise of an empire and the slow, gradual decline of an empire leading to its fall. Same can be said about a system, a culture, a society, etc. But that's not really how human institutional organizations work. In fact, the fall of a system tends to happen after a tipping point is reached. And that tipping point might be reached at a time when the participants of the system don't realize it. Right? The fall of the Soviet Union, and the fact that it happened so rapidly, was not predicted by most international analysts. Right? The Bronze Age collapse at the end of the Bronze Age happened in a matter of 30 years, where thousands of years of civilizational development in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Right? So once society reaches a tipping point, systems can collapse rapidly. And I want you to think of the global systems and the institutions we're enmeshed in, NATO, the United Nations, international law, and so forth, as these complex systems that, unbeknownst to us, can easily reach a tipping point and collapse much more easily than we thought. That's my first challenge to you. The second challenge in thinking about the global order is thinking about how the global balance sheet is composed. Historically, right, if we think of the world's assets equal liabilities plus equity, most growth in assets was driven by a growth in equity, actual value creation from products sold and extracted from the ground and services delivered. But in the past 50 years or so, most asset growth on the world's balance sheet has been driven by debt, a liability, not equity growth, right? Especially in developed countries, where debt is easy to come by because interest rates are lower than in the developing world. So in a world drunk on debt and asset creation through debt creation, developing countries are actually at a disadvantage because they're not able to get debt and increase debt assets as efficiently as developed nations are. So think of the world's balance sheet and think of the new era of increasing assets through debt rather than equity. And the third way that I challenge you to think of the world order is to abandon our view of nation states as being the primary movers of that order. Actually, if we look at history, nation states being the primary actors of international relations is an aberration. Even in the history of, say, this country and its relations with the rest of the world, as recently as 200 years ago, the East India Company, a private corporation, had more effect on India's relations with the world than any state actor did. We are seeing the emergence of that kind of international order where other actors, for example, private actors, have more of an impact on the international order than nation states once had. If I'd been on this panel 5 years ago, I would have said that maybe we can conceptualize Apple having its own foreign policy at some point. Now I would rather say we can think of Tesla as having its own foreign policy. No, it's not that far of a stretch. So when you think of the global order,
Aaron, in the interest of time,
back.
I'm probably going to cut you off, but really popcorn it over to Sumati and really talk about what's next in nonprofit. And if you can kind of kick us off there, Sumati, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Namit. I'm going to take a little bit of shift from policy and business to think about the third pillar of society. It's often said that social change is brought together by 3 pillars. You know, you think of government, you think of community leaders who are driving the change on the field, and the third one is philanthropy. So private capital for social good. What's next? I think what's next is on 2 fronts. One is that we're sitting at a cusp of a great wealth transfer. Its moving generations is expected to be around $84 trillion. Moving from the last generation to this one, which means 1, a move to younger people, and 2, an interesting move to more women. As women move up the economic mobility ladder, we have more women in businesses, we have more millionaires, and hopefully billionaires. That also means there'll be more women in philanthropy. That's interesting because there are a lot of studies that say women give differently. They give with a little bit more of a heart than we've seen traditional philanthropy operate with. It's trust-based, they center community. It's not about giving community leaders a seat on the table, it's about building a table with them. So there's a lot of co-creation happening in this space. We're also seeing a very strong focus on equity. So as foreign policies change and government agendas move, there is still a very strong focus on equity when it comes to young women who want to give to issues that matter to them, to women who look like them and have lived experiences like them. So I think the big change, in my opinion, in this space is really the seeding power, where money does not equal power, and you really value experiences, the work that people are doing, and center people who are on the forefront of this work.
Very well summed up. Thank you, Sumati. And last but not the least, definitely, Manthan, if you want to kick us off on what's next in climate change, which is one of the hot topics currently, just share your perspectives as an investor there. And I know you do a lot of advocacy work too, so over to you.
Thank you, Namit. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Today, I want to talk to you about changing the vision and the language of climate change. But before that, let me tell you my story. I grew up in a small town, and I saw my father weld steel and metal together to make fabrication equipment. And growing up in constraints, I saw like one has to work really, really hard to break free from that. Over the next 10 years, from age 6 to age 16, I tried to become a national champion and write a book. And in that experience, I realized to achieve anything meaningful, one needs a plan, but not enough time. And I think the same applies to climate change. I admire leaders who pursue moonshots, Mr. Kartikeya Sharma, Professor Brian Cox, Professor Brian Greene, Mr. Awais Ahmed, who have challenged the status quo and done something amazing with business, enterprise, technology, so on and so forth. But at every meaningful global conference like this one, at NEXT, we often hear global leaders talk about pledges and commitments for net zero and so on and so forth. But right now, I'd like to share how we are at the midpoint in the climate transition. We are 27 years after 1997 of Kyoto Protocol and 27 years to the 2050 global decarbonization goals. Yet, most of our heavy industries, steel, cement, aluminum, so on and so forth, still rely on fossil fuels. And in fact, the dependence on fossil fuels has increased to 87%. So in this entire conundrum, I realized that we are missing something very important. We are not convincing the local business to adopt to climate change. Last year, at COP28, I was organizing a pavilion for Saudi Arabia, and there was a 200-page document talking about how Saudi Arabia was trying to transition to net zero. And as I opened the first page, it was full of jargons. SBTI, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, so on and so forth. I was a bit perplexed. I was Googling what do these jargons mean. I asked my friends and colleagues, and they were also a bit flummoxed. And that's what took me back to my beginning, like the same father who welded steel together. If I couldn't understand what SBTI or Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 meant, how could I convince someone like my dad to buy a steel which is 30% more expensive because it's green steel? So I think going ahead to achieve net zero, to get in there win time, we need to simplify our language, keep even more bold ambitions, have a plan, but act with urgency as if we have no time. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to wrap up, and since this is very fitting, since we have two former heads of state here already, one question, and I might ask just a couple of you, is really, as the next generation, what are the qualities and leadership traits that you believe are essential for the leader of your country? And what do you guys really look for, when you look at a leader in your country? And maybe, Ariel, you can kick us off, and I can then popcorn it to someone else.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think the one that comes to mind for me is receptivity, right? And to be receptive to what that next gen is. I think too often governments, policymakers, regulators, what have you, will react with a little bit of a fear response when there's something new in a marketplace or new in a social cause, rather than kind of embracing and learning alongside the population that might have brought that forth and really kind of encouraging engagement in a smart and thoughtful way. I think what's happening right now in cryptocurrency is a great example of that. Whether or not you're a proponent of crypto, if you think it's gambling or a true store of value, I think is irrelevant to a certain extent, because it needs to be embraced, it needs to be monitored. There is a marketplace. So I think that receptivity is going to be critical, particularly in financial matters.
Well, thank you. I think I also have a little bit of an opinion here. I do think that what I look for is they pick leaders within their respective parliaments that are also represent the young generation, right? Like if you look at the average age of a parliament in most countries, it's significantly at the upper limit. So the hope is really to get equal representation, or significant representation, if at all, if that could help. With that, can I popcorn it to you, Sumati, and really ask you, what do you look for in the leader of your country?
Namit, I think you almost read my mind, because representation was on my mind. I'd love to see more leaders who look like us. I'd love to see more young women in leadership positions, because it truly matters. When you see someone who looks like you, understands your lived experiences, they're able to respond better. I think the other thing is, with young people, our attention spans are really low. Guys, we're bombarded with information at all times. So a leader who is straightforward, actionable, and has a feedback loop, I think would be really appreciated.
Well, thank you. Chandler, do you have opinions there?
Yeah, I think one thing that jumps out to me when I think about future American leaders in our country's context is, some history of public service, I think, is something that I would really encourage. Whether it be the military or teaching or any other avenue, I think at some point in one's career, it's a really, growthful opportunity. And then I think on top of that, if you can combine that with some level of just basic background in some sort of business context, I think that's especially useful and is going to become even more relevant, with all this new impacts of emerging technologies.
Well, thank you. I know we have about a minute left, and I think I just really close by saying that from all that's really being said today, what I really hear is future isn't something that we wait for, but we really work on creating it to a certain extent, be it in finance, be it in philanthropy, be it in global governance and international relations. But it's been a pleasure having all of you guys, and on behalf of Next, I thank you all for coming. And I thank Karthikeya and the entire NXT team also for giving all of us the opportunity to be here. Thanks so much.
That, of course, was a pretty youthful conversation there of the young